The jungle breathed with malevolent life as Marine Private First Class Johnny Martinez pressed his face against the muddy earth of Henderson Field. Above him, the distinctive drone of Japanese Betty bombers filled the pre-dawn darkness of August 7th, 1942. This was at the moment that would define America's first major offensive against the Empire of Japan in the Pacific Theater. Martinez had volunteered for the 1st Marine Division just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, driven by the same righteous fury that swept across America following December 7th, 1941. Now, crouched in a foxhole on this godforsaken island in the Solomon Chain, he wondered if his mother's prayers back in San Antonio would be enough to see him through what was coming. The plan seemed straightforward enough when Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner had briefed the assault forces aboard the transport ships 3 days earlier. Operation Watchtower, sarcastically dubbed Operation Shoestring by the Marines, due to its hasty preparation, called for simultaneous landings on Guadalcanal and nearby Tulagi. Intelligence reports indicated the Japanese were constructing an airfield on Guadalcanal's northern coast, a strategic position that could threaten Allied supply lines to Australia and New Zealand. As reported in the August 1942 edition of Time magazine, the stakes could not have been higher for American morale and strategic positioning in the Pacific. Major General Alexander Archer Vandegrift's 1st Marine Division, supported by elements of the 2nd Marine Division, would spearhead America's transition from defensive to offensive operations against an enemy that had seemed invincible for 8 months. The irony was not lost on Martinez that they were fighting for an island most Americans couldn't pronounce, let alone locate on a map. Guadalcanal, a name that would soon become synonymous with heroism, sacrifice, and the turning tide of war in the Pacific. The island stretched 90 miles long and 25 miles wide, covered in dense tropical jungle, razor-sharp ridges, and pestilent swamps that bred disease as efficiently as they bred mosquitoes. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Goetsch had painted a grim picture during the final briefing. "Gentlemen," he had said, his weathered face serious beneath his campaign hat, "we're not just taking an airfield. We're proving to the world that Americans can take the fight to the Japanese and win. Every man who sets foot on that beach tomorrow carries the hopes of a nation that's been on its heels since Pearl Harbor." The pre-invasion bombardment had begun at dawn, with cruisers and destroyers pounding the shoreline where intelligence suggested Japanese positions. From his position on the USS Macaulay, Martinez had watched the orange flashes illuminate the jungle canopy, each explosion a thunderclap of American determination. The sound rolled across the water like the voice of an angry god, promising retribution for Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, Bataan, and Corregidor. Now, as the landing craft ground against the coral and sand of Red Beach, Martinez felt history pivoting. On this moment, behind him stretched the longest supply line in military history, 7,000 miles back to the West Coast. Ahead lay an enemy that had conquered half the Pacific with seemingly unstoppable efficiency. The Marine beside him, a kid from Nebraska named Tommy Wilson, was praying in whispers. Martinez couldn't make out the words over the din of engines and distant artillery, but he understood the sentiment. They were about to write their names in history, one way or another. The morning of August 7th brought an eerie calm that veterans would later describe as the quiet before hell unleashed itself. Martinez splashed through knee-deep surf, his Springfield rifle held high, as the first waves of Marines stormed ashore at Red Beach near Lunga Point. To his amazement, no withering machine gun fire greeted them. No mortar rounds churned the sand into deadly fountains. The jungle remained ominously silent. "Where the hell are they?" shouted Sergeant Mike O'Malley, a career Marine whose Irish brogue had been sharpened by 20 years of service from Nicaragua to China. His question echoed in the minds of every Marine who had expected to face the fanatical resistance that characterized Japanese defensive tactics throughout the Pacific. The answer came quickly enough. Japanese construction workers and a few scattered guards had fled into the jungle at the first sign of the massive Allied fleet offshore. By noon, Marines were walking through an abandoned construction site where nearly 2,000 Japanese laborers had been carving an airfield from the jungle and coral. Heavy equipment sat abandoned, meals half-eaten in mess halls, and radio equipment still warm to the touch. Colonel Pedro del Vail's 11th Marines Artillery Regiment quickly established fire bases while engineering units assessed the captured airfield. The runway was roughly 60% complete, with a packed coral surface that American engineers determined could be operational within days, with proper equipment and effort. As documented in Samuel Eliot Morrison's official Navy history, the struggle for Guadalcanal. The ease of the initial landing created a dangerous sense of overconfidence among some Allied commanders. This optimism would prove tragically premature when Japanese naval forces struck back. With devastating effectiveness just 2 days later, Martinez found himself assigned to a perimeter defense position along what would become known as the Lunga Perimeter, a defensive line carved from jungle and swamp that protected the vital airfield. The work was backbreaking, digging foxholes in coral hard ground, stringing barbed wire through dense vegetation, and establishing fields of fire through jungle so thick that visibility rarely extended beyond 50 yards. The Japanese response began with air raids. On August 8th, 18 twin-engine Betty bombers, escorted by Zero fighters, swept in from the northwest, targeting the invasion fleet anchored off the beaches. Marine Wildcat fighters from the carrier Enterprise rose to meet them, and Martinez watched in fascination as aerial combat unfolded above his head like a deadly ballet. Ensign Robert Disson's Wildcat tangled with a Zero at barely 500 feet altitude, their engines screaming as they twisted through turns that would have killed lesser pilots. The Zero's superior maneuverability was evident, but Disson's Wildcat could absorb punishment that would have destroyed the lightly built Japanese fighter. When Disson finally lined up his shot, his 650 caliber machine guns shredded the Zero's wing, sending it spinning into the jungle in a ball of orange flame and black smoke. But the real shock came that night. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa had assembled a force of 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer for a night attack against the Allied fleet, supporting the landing. Japanese naval training emphasized night combat, and their crews had drilled endlessly in the art of nocturnal warfare. At precisely 1:38 in the morning on August 9th, Mikawa's force struck with devastating precision. The cruisers Astoria, Quincy, Vincennes, and Canberra were caught completely unprepared for the fury of Japanese night fighting tactics. Long lance torpedoes, each carrying a warhead capable of breaking a cruiser's back, streaked through the dark water like underwater lightning. Martinez heard the battle from his foxhole 5 miles away, the thunder of naval gunfire, the brilliant flashes that turned night into day, and the occasional explosion so massive it shook the ground beneath his feet. When dawn revealed for Allied cruisers, on the bottom of what would forever be known as Iron Bottom Sound, the Marines on Guadalcanal realized they were truly alone. Admiral Turner, fearing for the safety of his remaining transports and supply ships, ordered the fleet to withdraw immediately. The Marines watched their lifeline steam over the horizon, leaving them with only 4 days' ammunition, limited medical supplies, and 17 days of food to face whatever the Japanese Empire could throw at them. The withdrawal of the Allied fleet left 23,000 Marines stranded on Guadalcanal with the crushing realization that they were now fighting for their lives as much as for strategic objectives. Martinez watched the last transport disappear over the horizon on August 9th and felt a cold certainty settle in his stomach. They were committed now, win or die. Major General Vandegrift gathered his senior officers that evening in what had been a Japanese construction shack, now serving as the 1st Marine Division command post. Maps of the island covered improvised tables made from packing crates, and the humid air reeked of insect repellent and cigarette smoke. "Gentlemen," Vandegrift began, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had fought in Nicaragua and Haiti, "we're going to hold this airfield, and we're going to make it operational. The Navy will be back, but until then, we're on our own." His words would prove prophetic. The Marines would indeed be largely on their own for the next 4 months of brutal combat. The first priority was completing the airfield, renamed Henderson Field in honor of Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine pilot killed at the Battle of Midway. Marine engineers, supported by captured Japanese equipment and CB construction battalions, worked around the clock to extend and improve the runway. The irony was bitter. American forces were completing a Japanese airfield. To use against Japanese forces, Colonel William Whaling's scouts reported disturbing intelligence from patrol activities. Beyond the perimeter, Japanese forces were landing reinforcements nightly using destroyers and fast cruisers in what became known as the Tokyo Express runs. These high-speed nighttime operations delivered troops, supplies, and ammunition while avoiding Allied air attacks during daylight hours. According to Richard Trigaskis's contemporary account, Guadalcanal Diary, published in 1943, the psychological pressure on the isolated Marines was intense. They could hear Japanese construction activities in the jungle, the sound of axes and saws, as the enemy built fortified positions, the rumble of heavy equipment being dragged through the dense vegetation, and most unnerving of all, the sound of voices speaking in a language none of them understood. Martinez found himself assigned to Lieutenant Robert Leckey's intelligence section, tasked with interrogating captured Japanese construction workers. The few prisoners they took revealed that Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki was landing forces at Tetter, 22 miles east of Henderson Field. With orders to recapture the airfield through aggressive night assault, the psychological warfare began immediately. Japanese loudspeakers, positioned in the jungle beyond rifle range, broadcast propaganda messages in broken English throughout the night. Marine, you die tomorrow night. Your wives sleep with other men while you die on Guadalcanal. Emperor shows mercy if you surrender now. More effective than the propaganda was the sound of Japanese construction activity. Martinez lay in his foxhole listening to the methodical chopping of axes, the scrape of shovels against coral, and the occasional bark of orders in Japanese. The enemy was building something out there in the darkness, and every Marine could feel the noose tightening. The first air attack against Henderson Field came on August 20th. 18 Betty bombers, escorted by Zero fighters, swept in from the northwest at precisely noon. The newly arrived Marine Fighter Squadron, 223, equipped with Wildcat fighters, rose to meet them in what would become a daily ritual of aerial combat. Captain Marion Carl's Wildcat Squadron tangled with the Japanese formation at 8,000 feet above the airfield. Carl himself would become the first Marine ace of the war, but on this day he was learning the deadly lessons of air combat against an experienced and determined enemy. The Zeros were faster and more maneuverable, but the American fighters could absorb devastating damage and continue fighting. The bombing was accurate enough to crater the runway in several places, but Marine engineers had it operational again. Within 6 hours, this pattern would repeat itself: daily Japanese air attacks followed by frantic repair work, night harassing raids followed by exhausted defenders strengthening their positions. At dawn. By August 20th, intelligence reports confirmed Martinez's worst fears. A full regiment of Japanese infantry was moving west along the coast toward Henderson Field, and radio intercepts suggested they intended to launch a major assault within days. The stage was set for the first major ground combat between American and Japanese forces in the Pacific Theater. The attack came on August 21st with the fury of a tropical typhoon and the precision of a Swiss watch. Martinez crouched in his foxhole along the Ilu River, formerly known as Tenaru Creek, as Colonel Ichiki's 900 Regiment prepared to demonstrate the superiority of Japanese night fighting tactics against what they considered soft American Marines. Intelligence had been tracking Ichiki's movement for 2 days. Patrol reports described a force of approximately 900 Japanese infantry moving west along the coastal track, heavily armed with machine guns, mortars, and the fanatical determination that characterized Imperial Japanese Army tactics. What intelligence could not convey was the absolute confidence these veterans carried. They had conquered Singapore, Hong Kong, and the Dutch East Indies. A handful of Marines on a jungle island would be swept aside like leaves before a hurricane. Lieutenant Colonel Al Pollock's 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines held the eastern bank of the Ilu River where it emptied into the sea. Their positions consisted of hastily dug foxholes, connected by communication trenches, with machine gun nests positioned to create interlocking fields of fire across the narrow coastal plain. Barbed wire strung between coconut palms created additional obstacles. Though everyone knew determined infantry could overcome such barriers, the preliminary bombardment began at midnight with mortar rounds walking across Marine positions like the footsteps of death itself. Each explosion sent coral fragments and palm fronds raining down on defenders, who pressed themselves against the earth and prayed their foxholes would hold. Martinez felt the concussion of each blast in his chest, a physical reminder that survival depended on luck as much as training. As documented in Marine Corps' historical records, compiled immediately after the battle, the Japanese assault began with characteristic precision at 0130 hours. Ichiki had chosen his point of attack carefully, a narrow sandbar where the Ilu River met the ocean, defended by a single Marine squad under Sergeant Johnny Rivers, a tobacco-chewing Kentuckian who had joined the Corps to escape a murder charge. Back home, the first wave consisted of approximately 200 Japanese infantry advancing in disciplined formation across the sandbar. Their approach was covered by machine gun fire from positions they had established in the jungle on the eastern bank, creating a deadly crossfire that pinned down Marine defenders and allowed the assault troops to close to within grenade range. Rivers and his 12 Marines opened fire when the Japanese reached the wire obstacles. The crash of rifle fire mixed with the distinctive chatter of Browning automatic rifles and the heavier bark of water-cooled machine guns positioned to sweep the sandbar. With deadly precision, tracer rounds drew red lines through the darkness, and the muzzle flashes created a strobing nightmare of light and shadow. But the Japanese kept coming. Martinez watched in horrified fascination as wave after wave of infantry charged across the sandbar, climbing over the bodies of fallen comrades, with the mechanical determination of men who considered death preferable to failure. Their battle cries, "Banzai, Tenno Hika Banzai," echoed across the water like the voices of demons emerging from hell itself. The crisis came when Japanese engineers succeeded in cutting lanes through the wire obstacles. Under cover of intense machine gun fire, a company of Imperial Marines, elite troops equivalent to American Rangers, poured through the gaps and established a foothold on the western bank of the river. For 20 terrifying minutes, Japanese infantry held Marine positions, and the outcome of the battle hung in the balance. Captain Charles Brush's reserve company counterattacked at 0 to 45 hours, advancing through jungle so dense that muzzle flashes provided the only illumination. The fighting was hand-to-hand, rifle butts against bayonets, grenades exploding at point-blank range, and men dying in whispered curses rather than heroic speeches. Martinez found himself face-to-face with a Japanese soldier no older than himself, both of them fumbling to reload rifles, with hands slippery from sweat and blood. The Japanese Marine was faster, but Martinez's Springfield rifle had a longer bayonet. The mathematics of close combat proved brutally simple. Martinez lived, and his opponent did not. Dawn revealed the magnitude of Ichiki's miscalculation. Nearly 800 Japanese bodies littered the sandbar and shoreline, while Marine casualties numbered less than 50. Colonel Ichiki himself committed ritual suicide rather than face the shame of defeat. But his sacrifice could not alter the fundamental lesson of August 21st. American Marines could fight and win against the supposedly invincible Imperial Japanese Army. The victory at the Ilu River proved to be merely the opening act of a drama that would stretch across for months of increasingly vicious combat. By early September, Martinez and his fellow Marines realized they were fighting not just for an airfield, but for the future direction of the Pacific War itself. Japanese reinforcements arrived nightly via the Tokyo Express, transforming Guadalcanal into a deadly chess game where each side maneuvered for advantage, while enduring constant harassment from air, sea, and land. Major General Harukichi Hayakitaka's 17th Army was methodically building combat strength for a decisive assault that would recapture Henderson Field and drive the Americans into the sea. The psychological pressure was relentless. Martinez spent his days repairing runway damage from nightly bombing raids, while his nights were consumed by patrol activities, guard duty, and the constant threat of infiltration attempts. Sleep became a luxury measured in minutes rather than hours. And every Marine learned to function on adrenaline, caffeine, and the bitter knowledge that capture meant torture and death. Marine Fighter Squadron 223 had established air superiority over Henderson Field during daylight hours, but Japanese naval forces controlled the surrounding waters after dark. This deadly rhythm created what Marines cynically called the schedule. American planes dominated during the day, Japanese ships dominated at night, and both sides bled personnel and equipment in a war of attrition that neither could afford to lose. Captain Joe Foss's fighter squadron was performing miracles with obsolete aircraft and improvised maintenance facilities. The Wildcat fighters were inferior to Japanese Zeros in speed and maneuverability, but superior in armored protection and firepower. American pilots learned to use these advantages, avoiding dogfights in favor of slashing attacks that maximized their aircraft's strengths while minimizing exposure to enemy capabilities. As reported in Newsweek magazine's October 1942 coverage of the Guadalcanal campaign, the strategic implications extended far beyond one jungle airfield. Japanese naval codes intercepted by Allied intelligence revealed that Emperor Hirohito himself was monitoring the battle's progress, viewing Guadalcanal as a test of American resolve. In the Pacific theater, the supply situation grew increasingly desperate as September progressed into October. Japanese submarines and air attacks had made daylight supply runs suicidal, forcing Allied logistics personnel to develop innovative solutions. Submarines began carrying aviation gasoline instead of torpedoes, while destroyers were converted into high-speed transports that could deliver critical supplies. During brief nighttime operations, Martinez found himself assigned to Lieutenant Colonel Herman Hannikin's raiding force, tasked with disrupting Japanese supply lines and gathering intelligence about enemy troop concentrations. These patrol activities provided a welcome break from the monotony of perimeter defense, but they also revealed the true scope of Japanese reinforcement efforts. Deep in the jungle south of Henderson Field, Marine patrols discovered evidence of massive construction projects. Japanese engineers were building artillery positions, supply dumps, and troop assembly areas in preparation for what radio intercepts suggested would be a coordinated assault involving naval bombardment, air attacks, and simultaneous ground assaults from multiple directions. The most disturbing discovery came from Technical Sergeant Mitchell Page's patrol on October 10th. His 12-man reconnaissance team had penetrated 15 miles south of the perimeter when they stumbled upon a Japanese supply convoy moving artillery pieces through the jungle. The guns were 150mm howitzers capable of reducing Henderson Field to rubble from positions beyond the range of Marine counter-battery fire. That night, Japanese loudspeakers broadcast a new message: Marines of Henderson Field, you have fought bravely, but your time is ending. Soon the Emperor's soldiers will reclaim this island, and your bones will fertilize the jungle where greater men than you have died. The psychological warfare was having its intended effect. Martinez noticed that conversations grew shorter, laughter became rare, and men cleaned their weapons with the mechanical intensity of soldiers who expected to die using them. Malaria, dysentery, and fungal infections were claiming as many casualties as enemy action, creating a medical crisis that threatened the defense as much as Japanese artillery. But American reinforcements were also arriving. The 164th Infantry Regiment from the Army's Americal Division landed in early October, bringing fresh troops and badly needed heavy weapons. The sight of soldiers wading ashore through the surf created a psychological boost that was almost as valuable as their combat capabilities. The stage was set for the decisive battle that would determine whether American forces could maintain their foothold in the Solomon Islands or whether Japanese naval and air superiority would prove decisive in a prolonged campaign of attrition. October 13th brought the kind of morning that made men question their faith in divine providence. Martinez awoke to find Henderson Field pockmarked with fresh bomb craters, 2 Wildcat fighters burning on the tarmac, and the unmistakable signs that Japanese forces were massing for their long-anticipated assault. The intelligence reports painted a grim picture. Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama's 2nd Division had arrived on Guadalcanal with orders to recapture Henderson Field through a coordinated attack that would demonstrate Japanese military superiority to the world. Radio intercepts revealed that Emperor Hirohito was personally monitoring the battle's progress, elevating Guadalcanal from a tactical engagement to a strategic test of wills between two nations. Martinez found himself attached to Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller's 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, positioned along what would become immortalized as Bloody Ridge. The defensive position consisted of a series of low hills south of Henderson Field, connected by hastily dug trenches and defended by Marines who had been fighting for over 2 months. Without relief, Puller was a legend even before Guadalcanal, a career Marine who had fought bandits in Nicaragua and Haiti, earning the nickname Chesty for his barrel chest and aggressive leadership style. His men worshipped him with the devotion usually reserved for religious figures, knowing that Puller would never ask them to go anywhere he wouldn't lead. "Boys," Puller addressed his assembled battalion on the morning of October 13th, his weathered face serious beneath his campaign hat. "The Japanese are coming tonight, and they're bringing everything they've got. We're going to hold this ridge, and we're going to make them pay for every inch of ground with their blood." According to Robert Leckey's first-hand account published in Helmet for My Pillow, the psychological pressure on the defenders was almost unbearable. Japanese artillery had been pounding Marine positions for 3 days, and the sound of enemy construction activities in the jungle suggested that Maruyama's forces were building assault positions within striking distance of the perimeter. The preliminary bombardment began at sunset with a ferocity that exceeded anything the Marines had experienced. Japanese 150mm howitzers, positioned in the jungle beyond the range of counter-battery fire, walked their shells across Marine positions with methodical precision. Each explosion sent coral fragments and jungle debris raining down on defenders, who pressed themselves against the earth and prayed their foxholes would hold. Martinez huddled in his fighting position next to Corporal Andy Jackson, a Cherokee Indian from Oklahoma whose calm demeanor under fire had earned him the respect of every Marine in the battalion. Jackson's ability to remain motionless for hours while observing enemy movement had saved lives during previous engagements, and his presence provided a psychological anchor for younger Marines facing their first major battle. The ground assault began at 11:30 p.m. with characteristic Japanese precision. Maruyama had divided his forces into 3 attack columns, each tasked with penetrating Marine defenses at a different point along Bloody Ridge. The Japanese believed that coordinated attacks from multiple directions would overwhelm American defenders and create opportunities for exploitation by reserve forces. The first wave consisted of approximately 400 Japanese infantry, advancing through jungle so dense that visibility was limited to a few yards. Their approach was covered by machine gun fire from positions they had established during 3 days of preparation, creating interlocking fields of fire that pinned down Marine defenders and allowed assault troops to close to grenade range. Martinez opened fire when the Japanese reached the wire obstacles, his Springfield rifle adding to the crescendo of combat that erupted along the entire length of Bloody Ridge. The muzzle flashes created a strobing nightmare of light and shadow, while tracer rounds drew red lines through the darkness like deadly fireworks celebrating death itself. But the Japanese kept coming with the mechanical determination of men who considered death preferable to failure. Their battle cries, "Banzai, Tenno Hika Banzai," echoed through the jungle like voices from hell itself, creating a psychological assault that was almost as effective as their physical attack. The crisis came when Japanese assault troops succeeded in penetrating Marine positions at 2 points along the ridge for 30 terrifying minutes. The outcome hung in the balance as hand-to-hand combat raged in foxholes and communication trenches. Martinez found himself fighting with bayonet and rifle but against Japanese Marines who attacked with the fury of religious fanatics seeking martyrdom. Sergeant Mitchell Page saved the day through an act of heroism that would earn him the Medal of Honor. When his machine gun section was overrun by Japanese assault troops, Page single-handedly carried a water-cooled machine gun to a new position. and held off an entire company of enemy infantry until reinforcements could arrive. His actions provided the time necessary for Puller to organize a counterattack that restored Marine positions. Dawn revealed the magnitude of Maruyama's defeat. Over 1,500 Japanese bodies littered the slopes of Bloody Ridge, while Marine casualties numbered less than 200. The psychological impact was enormous. American forces had proven they could defeat Japan's elite divisions in sustained combat under the most adverse conditions. The morning of October 26 found Martinez staring across Iron Batam Sound at a sight that would have seemed impossible just for months earlier. A fleet of American transports was approaching Guadalcanal in broad daylight, escorted by cruisers and destroyers flying the stars and stripes with unmistakable confidence. The siege of Henderson Field was finally ending. The Japanese withdrawal had begun immediately after the defeat on Bloody Ridge. Radio intercepts revealed that Emperor Hirohito himself had authorized the evacuation of surviving forces tacitly, acknowledging that Guadalcanal could not be held against determined American resistance. The Tokyo Express runs continued, but now they were evacuating troops rather than delivering reinforcements. Major General Vandegrift assembled his senior officers on November 1st to assess the strategic implications of their victory. The command post had been moved to a captured Japanese bunker complex, complete with electric lighting and air conditioning that seemed impossibly luxurious. After months of jungle warfare, "Gentlemen," Vandegrift began, his voice carrying the authority of a commander who had proven American forces could defeat the Japanese Empire in sustained combat. "We've accomplished something more important than capturing an airfield. We've proven that Japanese forces are not invincible, and we've provided the foundation for offensive operations throughout the Pacific theater." The statistics were staggering. Japanese forces had lost over 25,000 killed during the 6-month campaign, while American casualties numbered approximately 7,000. More importantly, Japan had lost irreplaceable naval aviation units, experienced infantry divisions, and the psychological advantage that had characterized their operations since Pearl Harbor. As documented in Time magazine's December 7, 1942 commemorative issue marking the first anniversary of Pearl Harbor, the Battle of Guadalcanal represented a fundamental shift in Pacific War dynamics. American industrial capacity was beginning to assert itself, while Japanese resources were being stretched across an empire that had expanded beyond their ability to defend effectively. Martinez found himself assigned to a Graves registration detail, a sobering reminder that victory came at a price measured in young lives cut short by bullets, bombs, and bayonets. The American cemetery at Henderson Field contained neat rows of white crosses, each representing a Marine or soldier who had paid the ultimate price for 18 square miles of jungle and coral. But the individual graves told only part of the story. Japanese losses were so catastrophic that burial details were still discovering bodies. Months after the fighting ended, the jungle had become a vast cemetery where the remains of Emperor Hirohito's soldiers served as grim testimony to the futility of challenging American resolve once it had been aroused. The relief of the 1st Marine Division began in December, with fresh Army units assuming responsibility for mopping up operations against scattered Japanese holdouts. Martinez boarded a transport on December 9th, his uniform hanging loose on a frame that had lost 30 pounds. During 6 months of combat in conditions that tested human endurance to its limits. As the transport cleared Iron Batam Sound, Martinez reflected on the transformation that had occurred since August 7th. They had arrived as young men influenced by Hollywood portrayals of warfare as a noble adventure. They departed as veterans who understood that combat was primarily about endurance, sacrifice, and the willingness to die for principles that could not be compromised. The strategic implications of Guadalcanal extended far beyond the Solomon Islands. Japanese naval codes revealed that the defeat had forced a fundamental reassessment of imperial strategy throughout the Pacific. Resources that had been allocated for offensive operations were now required for defensive preparations, marking the beginning of Japan's transition from expansion to survival. Martinez returned to San Antonio in February 1943. carrying with him the knowledge that American forces had passed their first major test against the Japanese Empire and emerged victorious. The young man who had volunteered after Pearl Harbor had been replaced by a veteran who understood that freedom required constant vigilance and occasional sacrifice. By those willing to pay freedom's price, the Battle of Guadalcanal had ended, but its lessons would influence American military strategy for generations. Martinez and his fellow Marines had proven that determination, superior logistics, and the willingness to endure hardship could overcome any enemy. Regardless of their reputation for invincibility, in the jungles of Guadalcanal, America had found its fighting spirit and pointed it toward Tokyo. Henderson Field continued to serve as a vital Allied air base throughout the Pacific War, supporting offensive operations that eventually brought American bombers within range of the Japanese home islands. The airfield that had cost so much blood to capture became the foundation for victory. In the largest theater of the most destructive war in human history, the ghosts of Guadalcanal would haunt Japanese military planning for the remainder of the war, serving as a constant reminder that American forces had learned how to fight and win against the Emperor's finest divisions, in proving their resolve on a jungle island most Americans had never heard of. The Marines and soldiers of Guadalcanal had begun the long march toward Tokyo Bay and final victory in the Pacific Theater.